The road to World War II began not in 1939, but 20 years earlier with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. This peace settlement would plant the seeds of an even more devastating conflict. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing terms on Germany. The nation lost 13% of its territory, all its colonies, and was forced to pay massive reparations that would cripple its economy for decades. The harsh treaty terms, combined with the global economic depression, created fertile ground for extremist movements. In Germany, hyperinflation destroyed savings, unemployment soared, and desperate people began looking for radical solutions. Three totalitarian regimes emerged to challenge the post-war order. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany promised to restore German greatness, Benito Mussolini's fascist Italy sought to revive Roman glory, and militarist Japan pursued imperial expansion across Asia. These regimes began testing international resolve through a series of aggressive actions. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, Italy attacked Ethiopia in 1935, and the Spanish Civil War became a proving ground for fascist military tactics. The Anschluss of Austria in 1938 demonstrated Hitler's expansionist ambitions. Despite being forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles, Germany absorbed Austria without firing a shot, emboldening further aggression. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939. This non-aggression agreement between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia shocked the world and cleared the way for Hitler's invasion of Poland. By 1939, the stage was set for global conflict. 20 years of resentment, economic crisis, failed diplomacy, and aggressive expansion had created a powder keg. The seeds planted at Versailles had grown into the deadliest war in human history. September 1st, 1939. At 4:45 a.m., German forces crossed the Polish border, unleashing a new form of warfare that would shock the world. This is the beginning of the Axis offensive that would light the fuse of global conflict. The German military introduced a revolutionary strategy called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This combined tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry in coordinated attacks that could penetrate enemy lines with unprecedented speed and force. Poland fell in just 27 days. The speed of German victory stunned the world. By May 1940, German forces had conquered Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and were advancing into France using the same devastating tactics. However, Germany's next target would prove more challenging. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940 as the Luftwaffe attempted to gain air superiority over the Royal Air Force. This aerial campaign would determine whether Britain could survive as the last bastion against Nazi expansion. While Germany focused on Britain, Italy opened a new front in North Africa. In September 1940, Italian forces under Marshal Graziani advanced into Egypt, seeking to capture the Suez Canal and expand Mussolini's African empire. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, tensions were escalating as Japan continued its expansion in China and Southeast Asia. The Axis powers were coordinating their offensives across multiple continents, setting the stage for a truly global conflict that would soon engulf the entire world. By 1941, the war was about to expand beyond all previous boundaries. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by tanks, aircraft, and artillery, invaded the Soviet Union along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. This Eastern Front would become the most brutal and devastating theater of the entire war. 6 months later, on December 7, 1941, the war truly became global. At 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor. The attack killed over 2,400 Americans and crippled the Pacific Fleet. This single act of aggression brought the United States fully into World War II, transforming it from a European conflict into a truly global war. Following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces rapidly expanded across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Within months, they had conquered the Philippines, Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and Burma, creating a vast Pacific empire. The war now raged across multiple continents and oceans. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the tropical islands of the Pacific, From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, the conflict had truly engulfed the world. By late 1941, the Axis powers controlled vast territories across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. This world map shows the unprecedented scale of Axis domination at its peak. Never before in human history had such a large portion of the world been under the control of aggressive military powers. The Axis-controlled territory from the Atlantic coast of France to the Pacific Islands, from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert. But the Allies were not defeated. The entry of the United States brought massive industrial capacity and fresh manpower to the fight. The Soviet Union, despite enormous losses, continued to resist on the Eastern Front. The war had become a global struggle between two opposing visions of the world. On one side, the Axis powers sought domination through conquest and oppression. On the other, the Allies fought for freedom, democracy, and human dignity. By the end of 1941, World War II had truly become a global conflict. The stage was set for the epic struggles that would determine the fate of nations and the future of human civilization. The Holocaust represents one of humanity's darkest chapters, a systematic campaign of persecution and murder orchestrated by Nazi Germany against Jews and other targeted groups. This crime against humanity was rooted in a toxic ideology of racial supremacy that would ultimately claim 6 million Jewish lives. The Holocaust began with Nazi ideology that portrayed Jews as a fundamental threat to German racial purity. This propaganda depicted a false choice between German victory and what they called the Bolshevik threat, using fear and hatred to justify increasingly extreme measures. The persecution of Jews followed a deliberate escalation. It began with legal discrimination, forcing Jews to wear identifying badges like the Yellow Star of David. This visible marking isolated Jews from German society and made them targets for further persecution. The Nazi regime established a vast network of concentration and extermination camps across occupied Europe. Auschwitz-Birkenau became the largest and most notorious, designed specifically for mass murder. This detailed map shows the systematic layout of death: gas chambers, crematoriums, and barracks where millions perished. Despite overwhelming odds, Jews and other persecuted groups organized resistance efforts. From the Warsaw Ghetto uprising to partisan activities across Europe, many fought back against Nazi oppression. However, global response was often limited, with many nations failing to provide adequate refuge for those fleeing persecution. As Allied forces liberated the camps in 1944 and 1945, the full horror of the Holocaust was revealed to the world. This haunting image shows the aftermath: Allied soldiers documenting the evidence of systematic murder. The scale of the atrocities shocked even hardened military personnel. The Nuremberg trials established a precedent for international justice, holding Nazi war criminals accountable for crimes against humanity. These proceedings, shown here, marked the first time in history that individuals were prosecuted for genocide on an international scale. The legacy of the Holocaust lives on through survivors like this individual, whose tattooed number serves as permanent testimony to the horrors endured. Holocaust education and remembrance remain crucial in preventing future genocides and preserving the memory of those who perished. The Holocaust stands as a stark reminder of what can happen when hatred and prejudice go unchecked. Through education, remembrance, and vigilance, we honor the victims and work to ensure that such atrocities never happen again. By 1942 and 1943, the tide of World War II began to shift dramatically. A series of crucial battles and campaigns marked the turning points that would ultimately determine the outcome of the global conflict. The Battle of Stalingrad, lasting from August 1942 to February 1943, became the defining moment of the Eastern Front. German forces, stretched thin across vast distances, became trapped in brutal urban warfare that would cost them an entire army. In North Africa, the Desert Fox Erwin Rommel had pushed Allied forces back to the gates of Egypt by mid-1942. However, the tide turned at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, beginning the long Allied advance that would drive Axis forces from Africa. Following victory in North Africa, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, followed by landings on the Italian mainland in September. This opened a new front in southern Europe and knocked Italy out of the war. June 6, 1944, marked the largest amphibious invasion in history. Operation Overlord saw 156,000 Allied troops land on the beaches of Normandy, opening the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe and beginning the liberation of Nazi-occupied France. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway in June 1942 crippled the Japanese Navy, while island-hopping campaigns like Iwo Jima in 1945 brought Allied forces within striking distance of Japan itself. These costly victories demonstrated both American industrial might and Japanese determination to fight to the end. These turning points of 1942 through 1944 fundamentally shifted the momentum of World War II. From Stalingrad to Normandy, from El Alamein to Midway, the Axis powers found themselves increasingly on the defensive as Allied industrial capacity and strategic coordination began to overwhelm their earlier advantages. By early 1945, the Nazi war machine was crumbling. Allied forces were closing in on Germany from all directions, setting the stage for the final collapse of Hitler's Third Reich. The Allied advance toward Berlin accelerated in the spring of 1945. From the west, British and American forces pushed across the Rhine, while Soviet armies approached from the east, squeezing Nazi Germany in a deadly vice. The final weeks of the war in Europe unfolded with dramatic speed. Key events in April and May 1945 would determine the fate of Nazi Germany and bring an end to the European theater of World War II. The Battle of Berlin was a devastating urban warfare campaign. Soviet forces fought street by street through the German capital, encountering fierce resistance from desperate Nazi defenders and civilian volunteers. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on his underground bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. With their leader dead and their capital falling, the Nazi regime began its final collapse. Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the ruins of Berlin, symbolizing the defeat of Nazi Germany. The city that had been the heart of Hitler's empire was now in Allied hands. On May 8, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender, officially ending the war in Europe. Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, sparked massive celebrations across the Allied nations as people rejoiced in the streets. However, victory brought new challenges. Europe lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and the task of rebuilding a shattered continent seemed overwhelming. The Allies now faced the complex challenge of establishing peace and preventing future conflicts. The fall of Nazi Germany marked the end of the European phase of World War II. After 6 years of devastating conflict, the continent could finally begin the long process of healing and reconstruction, though the war in the Pacific would continue for several more months. By August 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached its final, devastating phase. Japan, though still fighting, faced an impossible situation as the Allies prepared to deliver the ultimate blow. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay, a B-29 superfortress, dropped the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare over the city of Hiroshima. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, detonated 1,900 feet above the city. The atomic explosion created a fireball reaching temperatures of over 3,000 degrees Celsius. The blast wave and thermal radiation instantly vaporized everything within a half-mile radius, leaving behind only shadows burned into concrete. 2 days later, on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. This million-man offensive shattered Japan's last major army and eliminated any hope of negotiating peace terms. On August 9th, while Soviet forces poured into Manchuria, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The plutonium bomb, Fat Man, killed approximately 40,000 people instantly and brought Japan's total atomic casualties to over 200,000. Faced with atomic devastation, Soviet entry into the war, and the complete collapse of their strategic position, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15th. The decision came after intense debates within the Japanese government about the unthinkable, unconditional surrender. News of Japan's surrender sparked massive celebrations worldwide. VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day marked the end of the deadliest conflict in human history. In cities across America and the Allied nations, people poured into the streets in jubilation. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General MacArthur accepted Japan's unconditional surrender as representatives from all Allied nations witnessed this historic moment that officially ended World War II. The end of the war brought both relief and enormous challenges. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and the world grappled with the implications of atomic weapons. The task of rebuilding Japan and establishing a lasting peace would define the post-war era. As the guns fell silent in 1945, the world faced the monumental task of rebuilding from the ashes of the most devastating conflict in human history. The post-war period would reshape global politics, establish new institutions, and create divisions that would define the next half-century. The first priority was justice. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in November 1945, established a precedent for international law by holding individuals accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. For the first time in history, the defense of following orders was rejected as justification for atrocities. Germany itself became the epicenter of a new ideological divide. The country was partitioned into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. This division would soon crystallize into 2 separate German states, symbolizing the emerging Cold War between former allies. The wartime alliance between the United States and Soviet Union quickly deteriorated into the Cold War. Ideological differences between capitalism and communism, combined with nuclear weapons, created a bipolar world order that would dominate international relations for decades. Amidst these tensions, the international community sought to prevent future conflicts through the formation of the United Nations in 1945. With 51 founding members, the UN represented humanity's hope for peaceful resolution of disputes and international cooperation in addressing global challenges. The war's devastation required massive reconstruction efforts. The Marshall Plan provided over $13 billion to rebuild Western Europe, while the Soviet Union pursued its own reconstruction in Eastern Europe. These efforts not only rebuilt infrastructure, but also reshaped political and economic systems across the continent. The legacy of World War II extends far beyond its immediate aftermath. The war fundamentally altered the global balance of power, accelerated decolonization, advanced human rights, and demonstrated both humanity's capacity for evil and its potential for justice.